When the HOA board tried to burn my lake cabin with my family inside, they had no idea I owned the fire department that would respond to their arson attempt. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that Saturday morning when everything changed. I was standing on my cabin's deck, coffee mug in hand, watching my 8-year-old daughter Emma skip stones across the mirror calm lake. My wife Sarah was inside making pancakes, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely peaceful. This cabin wasn't just a weekend getaway, it was our sanctuary, the place where 3 generations of my family had built memories. My grandfather built it with his own hands in 1967, and every plank, every nail held stories that no amount of money could replace. Then I smelled it. Smoke. Not the pleasant campfire kind, but the acrid chemical smell of something burning that shouldn't be. My stomach dropped as I turned toward the back of the property where our storage shed stood. Orange flames were already licking up the sides, and the fire was spreading fast, too deliberately toward the main cabin. "Sarah!" I shouted, my voice cutting through the morning stillness. "Get Emma and get to the car. Now." I didn't wait for questions. I sprinted toward the shed, my mind racing. This wasn't an accident. The shed had been bone dry for weeks, and there was nothing inside that could spontaneously combust. Someone had set this fire, and they'd timed it perfectly for a Saturday morning when they knew we'd be here, trapped with limited escape routes. As I got closer, I saw them. 3 figures in dark clothing moving through the trees behind our property line, trying to stay hidden but failing miserably. One of them was talking urgently into a phone, and even from 50 yards away, I recognized that voice. Robert Chen, president of the Pine Lake Estates, HOA. The same man who'd been making our lives hell for the past 6 months with increasingly aggressive demands to sell our non-conforming cabin. My hands shook as I dialed 911, but it wasn't from fear, it was from pure, white-hot rage. These people had just tried to murder my family. They'd crossed every line that decent human beings don't cross, all because our rustic cabin didn't match their vision of a pristine lakefront community. 911, what's your emergency? This is a structure fire at 247 Lakeshore Drive, I said, my voice deadly calm despite the chaos around me. I need fire and police immediately. And dispatch, tell them the owner of North Shore Fire Services is on scene. They'll know what that means. The dispatcher's tone shifted instantly. Copy that, sir. Units are en route. What Robert Chen and his cronies didn't know what they were about to learn in the most spectacular way possible was that 6 months ago, I'd quietly purchased the controlling stake in North Shore Fire Services, the private fire department that held the emergency response contract for our entire county. They thought they were dealing with just another homeowner they could bully and intimidate. They had no idea they'd just declared war on the man who controlled every fire truck, every emergency response, and every fire safety inspection in a 50-mile radius. As I watched the flames spread toward my family's legacy, something crystallized inside me. This wasn't just about property damage or insurance claims anymore. These people had tried to kill my wife and daughter. They'd turned a peaceful Saturday morning into a nightmare that would haunt Emma for years. And they'd done it with such arrogance, such certainty, that they'd never face consequences. They were about to discover just how wrong they could be. Sarah's car started behind me, and I felt a moment of relief knowing they were safe. But as I stood there, watching our storage shed burn, listening to the distant wail of sirens that I knew were coming to help me, I made a promise. Robert Chen and his HOA board had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They'd picked a fight with the wrong family, at the wrong time, with the wrong man, and I was going to make sure they never forgot it.to understand why what happened that morning cut so deep. You need to know what this cabin really meant to my family. This wasn't some investment property or vacation rental. This was the heart of everything we were. My grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, bought this land in 1967 for $800 every penny he had after coming home from Vietnam. He was 23 years old, broken in ways that generation never talked about, and he needed somewhere to heal. The land was considered worthless back then, too remote, too wild, accessible only by a dirt road that turned to mud every spring. Perfect for a man who wanted to disappear from the world and rebuild himself from scratch. He spent 2 years building that cabin with nothing but hand tools and stubborn determination. Every log was cut from trees on the property. Every stone in the fireplace was pulled from the lake bottom. Every nail was driven by his own hands. My grandmother used to tell me stories about those early days, how she'd bring him sandwiches and find him still working by lamplight, covered in sawdust and sweat, refusing to quit until each wall was perfectly square. When my father inherited the place in 1994, he could have sold it for a fortune. The lake had become popular. Developers were circling like vultures, offering crazy money for waterfront property. But Dad understood what Grandpa had built here. It wasn't just a cabin. It was a sanctuary, a place where our family could always come home to something real and solid and true. I learned to swim in that lake. I caught my first fish off that dock. I carved my initials in the oak tree out back when I was 12, right next to my father's and grandfather's mark. When Sarah and I got married, we honeymooned there. When Emma was born, the first family photo we took was on that deck, 3 generations of Mitchell men holding the newest member of our clan. That's what made the HOA's interference so infuriating. They'd moved into our neighborhood, our grandfather's neighborhood, and decided that our family's legacy didn't fit their aesthetic vision. Pine Lake Estates had been developed around us, turning what used to be wilderness into a suburban paradise of identical McMansions and perfectly manicured lawns. And somehow, we'd become the problem. Robert Chen had made it personal from day one. The first time I met him was at a neighborhood barbecue 6 months earlier. He'd introduced himself as the HOA president, then immediately launched into his concerns about property values and community standards. He'd stood there in his polo shirt and khakis, gesturing at my grandfather's cabin like it was some kind of eyesore. "I'm sure you understand," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescending sympathy, "that rustic charm is fine for camping, but we're building something special here. A real community. Your property, well, it's bringing down everyone's investment." I'd stayed calm that night, explained the history, tried to help him understand what he was asking me to destroy. But Chen wasn't interested in understanding. He was interested in control, in forcing everyone to conform to his vision of suburban perfection. The harassment started small. Violation notices for having non-conforming exterior lighting. They were talking about the lanterns my grandfather had installed 50 years ago. Complaints about our unkempt landscaping, the wildflowers and native plants that had been growing naturally for decades. Citations for our unauthorized dock modifications repairs I'd made to the same dock my father and grandfather had maintained for 30 years. Each notice came with the same veiled threat: pay the fines, make the changes, or face legal action. And always, the suggestion that we could resolve this easily by selling to one of Chen's developer friends who would restore the property to community standards. What Chen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been preparing for this fight longer than they realized. 6 months ago, when the harassment first started, I'd made a strategic decision. North Shore Fire Services, the private company that held the emergency response contract for our county, had been struggling financially. The owner was ready to retire, and I had the capital to help. So I bought in quietly, as a silent partner at first, then gradually increased my stake until I held controlling interest. It wasn't about revenge, it was about protection. I knew that people like Chen respected only one thing: power. And I just acquired the kind of power they couldn't fight with HOA bylaws and legal threats. Every fire safety inspection in the county went through my people. Every emergency response, every building permit consultation, every safety compliance check, all of it flowed through North Shore Fire Services. I now controlled the very infrastructure that kept their precious community safe and legal. But I'd kept that information private, handling the business through lawyers and shell companies, letting Chen and his cronies continue believing they were dealing with just another powerless homeowner they could bully into submission. That morning, watching my family's storage shed burn while Chen's arsonists fled through the woods, I realized the time for quiet preparation was over. They'd escalated beyond legal harassment, beyond intimidation tactics. They'd tried to murder my family, and that changed everything. The sirens were getting closer now, and I knew that when those fire trucks arrived, Chen was about to get the education of his lifetime. He thought he was playing chess with a pawn. He had no idea he'd just declared war on the king. The fire trucks arrived like avenging angels, 3 massive red engines screaming down our dirt road, followed by the fire marshal's SUV and 2 police cruisers. But what happened next was something I'll never forget. As my crew began setting up to contain the blaze, I saw Robert Chen emerge from the tree line, no longer trying to hide. The arrogant bastard was actually walking toward the scene, probably planning to play the concerned neighbor who just happened to be hiking nearby when he noticed the smoke. He had no idea what was waiting for him. Fire Marshal David Rodriguez was the first to spot me. We'd worked together for months since I'd taken over North Shore Fire Services, and he knew exactly who I was. He jogged over, his face grim but professional. "Thomas, what's the situation?" he asked, pulling out his notepad. "Arson," I said simply, pointing toward Chen, who was now about 30 yards away, still approaching with that fake concerned expression. 3 suspects fled through the woods after setting the shed. The man in the blue jacket there? Robert Chen, HOA president. I watched him coordinate the whole thing from behind those trees. Rodriguez's expression hardened. In our county, arson wasn't just a property crime. Too many lives had been lost to wildfires, started by idiots who thought they could control fire. "You sure about the identification?" "Absolutely certain. He's been harassing my family for months, trying to force us to sell. This morning, he escalated to attempted murder." Rodriguez nodded and radioed for additional police backup. Then Chen made his fatal mistake. He walked right up to us, that plastic smile still plastered on his face. "My goodness, what a terrible accident," Chen said, extending his hand to Rodriguez as if they were meeting at a country club. "I'm Robert Chen, president of the Pine Lake Estates, HOA. I was out for my morning walk when I noticed the smoke. Is everyone okay? Is there anything our community can do to help?" The performance was flawless. Concerned neighbor, community leader, pillar of suburban society. If I hadn't seen him orchestrating the arson with my own eyes, I might have been impressed by his acting skills. Rodriguez didn't take his hand. Instead, he studied Chen with the cold professionalism of a man who'd investigated hundreds of fires. "Mr. Chen, I'm Fire Marshal Rodriguez. This is Thomas Mitchell, the property owner. He's alleging that you were involved in setting this fire." Chen's smile never wavered, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, a momentary calculation, like a computer processing an unexpected error. "I'm sorry, what?" "That's completely absurd. Why would I burn down my neighbor's property? We're all in this community together." "Cut the shit, Chen," I said, stepping forward. "I saw you back there in the trees with your 2 buddies. I heard you on the phone coordinating the timing. You thought you could murder my family and walk away clean." Now the mask started to slip. Chen's smile became strained, and his voice took on that condescending tone I'd learned to hate. "Thomas, I understand you're upset about the fire, but these wild accusations are exactly the kind of irrational behavior that's been concerning the board. Perhaps the stress of trying to maintain a property that's clearly beyond your means. Mr. Chen, Rodriguez interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. I need you to understand something. This is now an active arson investigation. Mr. Mitchell has made specific allegations about your involvement, and I'm going to need you to come down to the station for questioning. Chen's composure cracked just a little more. This is harassment. I'm a respected member of this community. I've done nothing but try to help the Mitchells understand that their property needs to meet basic community standards. If they want to make false accusations because they can't handle constructive feedback. Constructive feedback? I felt my temper starting to boil over. You've been terrorizing my family for months. Fake violation notices, cutting off our utilities, intimidating my wife when I'm not home. And now you tried to burn us alive because we wouldn't sell to your developer buddies. Chen finally abandoned all pretense of neighborly concern. His face hardened, and I saw the real man underneath cold, calculating, utterly convinced of his own superiority. Listen carefully, Mitchell. You have no idea what you're dealing with. This HOA has connections throughout this county, legal, political, financial. We have lawyers who will bury you in paperwork. We have relationships with every contractor, every inspector, every permit office. You think you can fight us with these pathetic conspiracy theories? He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to drop these ridiculous accusations. You're going to apologize to this fire marshal for wasting his time. And then you're going to seriously consider the generous offers our development partners have made for your property. Because if you think this morning was unpleasant, you have no idea how much worse your life can become. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Chen was so confident, so certain that he held all the cards. Behind him, I could see his two accomplices had returned and were standing at the edge of the property, probably ready to provide alibis for their boss. Rodriguez was taking notes, getting every word of Chen's implicit confession on record. But I could see Chen didn't care. He truly believed he was untouchable, that his HOA connections made him immune to consequences. That's when I decided it was time to play my trump card. Robert, I said, my voice suddenly calm and almost friendly. You mentioned connections throughout the county. Legal, political, financial connections. That's interesting because I have some connections of my own. I pulled out my business card, not my regular one, but the one that identified me as majority owner of North Shore Fire Services. I handed it to Rodriguez first, who glanced at it and nodded with understanding. Then I offered it to Chen. He took it without looking, still focused on his intimidation routine. Whatever small-time contacts you think you have, Mitchell, they're nothing compared to. Then he read the card. His face went white. You see, Robert, I continued conversationally, when you mentioned inspectors and permit offices, you forgot about one crucial department. Fire safety. Every building in this county, every business, every development project, they all need fire department approval. Safety inspections, emergency access permits, occupancy certificates. And as of 6 months ago, I control every single one of those decisions. Chen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The arrogant confidence drained from his face as the implications hit him. Rodriguez was trying not to smile, and I could hear my fire crew chuckling behind us. So here's what's actually going to happen, I said, my voice still pleasant, but with steel underneath. You're going to jail for arson and attempted murder. Then I'm going to conduct a comprehensive fire safety review of every single property in Pine Lake Estates. I'm betting I'll find some very interesting violations. Chen finally found his voice. You can't do this. This is abuse of power, conflict of interest. What I can't do, I interrupted, is ignore arson in my jurisdiction. What I can't do is overlook fire safety violations that endanger lives. But conducting thorough, by-the-book inspections of properties owned by people who tried to murder my family? That's not just legal, Robert. That's my civic duty. The look of pure panic on Chen's face was worth 6 months of harassment. He'd played his hand, shown all his cards, and discovered too late that he'd been playing against a stacked deck. You'd think that getting arrested for arson would slow Chen down. You'd be wrong. If anything, it made him more desperate, more vicious, and infinitely more stupid. The man who'd tried to burn my family alive was out on bail within 48 hours, and apparently he'd decided that his best defense was a good offense. The first sign of his escalation came Tuesday morning when I tried to turn on our water at the cabin. Nothing, not a drop. I checked the main line and found that someone had shut off our service at the street. When I called the utility company, they informed me that the Pine Lake Estates, HOA, had filed an emergency complaint claiming our property was creating sewage runoff issues that threatened the community water supply. Complete fabrication, of course. Our septic system had been inspected and certified just 6 months earlier, but the complaint triggered an automatic service suspension, pending investigation, and the investigation could take weeks. Sarah was furious. "They can't just cut off our water based on lies," she said, pacing around our kitchen while Emma played with her toys, blissfully unaware that adults could be this petty and cruel. "Actually, they can," I admitted. "The utility companies have to take environmental complaints seriously, even fake ones." Chen knows exactly how to manipulate the system, but cutting off our water was just the beginning. By Wednesday, our electricity was gone too, another emergency complaint about unsafe wiring that supposedly posed a fire hazard. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't putting my family through hell. The man who'd literally tried to burn us alive was now claiming we were a fire risk. Thursday brought a certified letter from Chen's lawyers. 5 pages of legal threats demanding we cease our harassment and intimidation of HOA board members. They were claiming that my revelation about owning the fire department constituted criminal conspiracy and abuse of public trust. They wanted a restraining order preventing me from conducting any fire safety inspections in Pine Lake Estates. "Listen to this," I told Sarah, reading from the letter. "They're saying I'm weaponizing my business interests to terrorize law-abiding community members. The guy who committed arson is accusing me of terrorism. But the thing that really pushed me over the edge happened Friday afternoon. I was at work, coordinating a training exercise for my firefighters, when Sarah called me in tears. They came to Emma's school," she said, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "Someone from the HOA, don't know which one, went to the principal and filed a complaint about our unsafe home environment. They're saying we're unfit parents because we're exposing Emma to fire hazards and contaminated water." My blood went cold. What did the school do? They have to investigate any complaint about child welfare. The principal was apologetic, but they're sending a social worker to inspect our house tomorrow. "Thomas, what if they try to take Emma away from us?" That was the moment Chen crossed the line from criminal to monster. Going after me was one thing. Going after my property, my business, even my freedom, I could handle that. But targeting my 8-year-old daughter, trying to destroy her sense of safety and security, using child services as a weapon in his petty neighborhood war? That was unforgivable. I hung up the phone and immediately called my attorney, Marcus Webb. Marcus had been handling the criminal case against Chen, but now I needed him for something bigger. "Marcus, I need you to prepare a comprehensive legal counterattack," I said. "I want Chen and his entire board destroyed financially, legally, personally. I want them to regret the day they ever heard my name." "Thomas, I understand you're angry, but..." They're trying to take my daughter away, I interrupted. They've escalated from property disputes to attempted child kidnapping through false reports. The gloves are coming off. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He'd seen Chen's type before, bullies who thought their money and connections made them untouchable. What do you need from me? Start with a federal civil rights lawsuit. Conspiracy to violate our rights under color of law. Then add harassment, intimidation, filing false reports, abuse of process. I want every member of that board named as defendants. And, Marcus, I want to bankrupt them. But even as I was planning my legal assault, Chen wasn't done. That same afternoon, I got a call from my fire chief reporting that someone had filed complaints with the state fire marshal's office about my conflict of interest in the arson investigation. They were claiming I'd fabricated evidence and coerced witness testimony to frame innocent community leaders. The state was sending investigators to review my department's handling of the case. If they found any irregularities, even minor procedural issues, it could cost me my fire department contracts and potentially result in criminal charges for obstruction of justice. Chen was playing chess while I was playing checkers, and he was 3 moves ahead. Every time I tried to use my legitimate authority to protect my family, he found a way to turn it against me. He understood the system better than I did, knew exactly which buttons to push to create maximum damage with minimum risk to himself. Saturday evening, as Sarah and I sat in our powerless, waterless cabin preparing for the social services inspection, I realized that Chen had successfully backed me into a corner. I could either fight back with everything I had, potentially destroying my own reputation and business in the process, or I could surrender and let him win. What are we going to do? Sarah asked, holding Emma close as our daughter slept between us in the candlelit darkness. I looked at my wife and child, then at the cabin my grandfather had built with his own hands, the legacy he'd passed down through 3 generations. Chen had taken our utilities, threatened our freedom, and now he was coming for our family. He'd left me no choice but to show him what a real war looked like. We're going to remind Robert Chen that he picked a fight with the wrong family, I said quietly. And we're going to make sure he never forgets the lesson. Sunday morning, I sat in my office at North Shore Fire Services headquarters, surrounded by 6 months of carefully documented evidence that Chen had no idea I'd been collecting. While he'd been playing his legal games and filing his fake complaints, I'd been building an airtight case that would destroy him and his entire corrupt organization. The beauty of owning the fire department wasn't just the authority it gave me, it was the access. Every building permit, every construction project, every safety inspection in Pine Lake Estates crossed my desk. And what I'd discovered in those files was a pattern of corruption so blatant, so systematic, that I almost couldn't believe Chen had been stupid enough to document it. My fire marshal, David Rodriguez, knocked on my office door. "You wanted to see me, boss?" "David, remember those routine inspections we've been doing in Pine Lake Estates over the past few months?" I asked, spreading the files across my desk. "Tell me what patterns you've noticed." Rodriguez sat down and studied the documents. He was a good man, 20 years in fire safety, completely by the book and incorruptible. Jesus Thomas. "Look at this. Every property owned by HOA board members has multiple code violations that were somehow never reported. Emergency access blocked by unauthorized structures, fire lane violations, non-compliant electrical work." "Keep going," I said. And here, he pointed to another stack of files. Every property owner who opposed the HOA's development plans got cited for phantom violations that don't even exist in the fire code. Someone's been weaponizing our inspection process. I nodded grimly. Now look at the signatures on the inspection reports. Rodriguez flipped through the papers, his expression darkening. These aren't our inspectors' signatures. Someone's been forging fire department approvals. That's not just corruption, Thomas. That's federal fraud. What we'd uncovered was a conspiracy that went far beyond neighborhood bullying. Chen and his board had been systematically falsifying fire safety documents to fast-track their developer friends' projects, while blocking anyone who opposed their vision. They'd been using forged fire department letterhead, creating fake inspection certificates, and even billing the county for inspections that never happened. The financial fraud alone was worth 20 years in federal prison. But what made it truly dangerous was the safety aspect. 3 of the major developments in Pine Lake Estates had been approved based on forged fire safety certificates. If there was ever a real emergency, people could die because of Chen's greed. "There's more," I said, pulling out another file. "Remember the Matthews family house fire last year? The one where the elderly couple barely escaped?" "Of course. We investigated that thoroughly. Look at this." I handed him the original HOA correspondence I'd found buried in the county files. Chen's people had been pressuring the Matthews to sell for months. When they refused, someone filed a complaint claiming their property was a fire hazard due to inadequate maintenance. 2 weeks later, their house burned down under suspicious circumstances. Rodriguez's face went pale. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to reopen that investigation. And I'm saying that Chen's been using arson as a business model long before he tried to kill my family." My phone buzzed with a text from my attorney. The social services inspection at our cabin was scheduled for 10 a.m. Monday, less than 24 hours away. Chen was still tightening the noose, still convinced he held all the advantages. He had no idea I was about to flip the board. I called Fire Chief Rebecca Santos at the State Fire Marshal's office. Rebecca and I had worked together for years before I bought into North Shore, and she knew my reputation for absolute integrity. "Rebecca, I need to report a major fraud case in my jurisdiction," I said. "Multiple felonies, federal crimes, potential additional arsons." "This is big." "How big?" she asked. "Big enough that I'm voluntarily requesting state oversight of my entire department while we investigate. I want everything by the book, no questions about conflict of interest." There was silence on the other end. Voluntarily requesting state oversight was career suicide if you had anything to hide. It was the kind of move that either cleared you completely or destroyed you forever. "Thomas, are you sure about this?" "Once I send investigators, there's no going back." "I'm sure." "And Rebecca?" "I need them here by tomorrow morning. Lives are at stake." After I hung up, I called my attorney with the game plan. "Marcus, I want you to contact the FBI White Collar Crime Division. We have documented evidence of mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the federal government, and multiple cases of arson for profit. I want federal charges filed against Chen and every member of his board." "Thomas, are you absolutely certain about this evidence? Because if we're wrong..." "We're not wrong." Chen got so arrogant, so confident in his untouchability that he documented everything. Bank records, forged documents, email communications, planning the arson attacks. It's all here. The final piece of my counterattack was the most satisfying. I pulled up Chen's own property records and smiled grimly. His beautiful lakefront mansion, the crown jewel of Pine Lake Estates, had never actually passed a legitimate fire safety inspection. The approval documents were all forgeries, signed by inspectors who'd never set foot on his property, which meant that technically, legally, his house was uninhabitable under county fire codes. And as the fire marshal for his jurisdiction, I had not just the right, but the legal obligation to condemn the property and order immediate evacuation. I drafted the condemnation notice personally, making sure every word was legally bulletproof. By the time Chen woke up Monday morning, he'd find official fire department seals on every door of his mansion, declaring it unsafe for human occupancy, pending a complete reconstruction to bring it up to code. The cost to fix all the violations? Conservatively, about $300,000. The time required? 6 to 8 months, assuming he could find contractors willing to work for someone facing federal fraud charges. But the real beauty of my plan wasn't just the immediate justice, it was the domino effect. Once the state investigators arrived and started pulling at the threads of Chen's corruption, the entire Pine Lake Estates development would unravel. Every forged inspection, every fraudulent permit, every backdoor deal would come to light. As I locked the evidence files in my safe and prepared to go home to my family, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Chen had pushed us to the breaking point, tried to destroy everything we loved, and nearly succeeded. But he'd made one fatal error. He'd assumed that because I owned a fire department, I was just another corrupt businessman like him. He never considered that I might actually care about integrity, about justice, about protecting people instead of exploiting them. Tomorrow, Robert Chen was going to learn the difference between owning power and earning it. And it was going to cost him everything. Monday morning at 8:47 a.m., I was standing on Robert Chen's perfectly manicured front lawn with Fire Marshal Rodriguez, 2 state investigators, and a sheriff's deputy, watching Chen's face cycle through confusion, anger, and pure terror as he read the condemnation notice I'd just served him. "This is impossible," he sputtered, his silk pajamas and designer slippers making him look absurdly out of place in what was rapidly becoming a crime scene. "This house was inspected and approved. I have all the certificates." "Yes, you do," I said calmly, pulling out my folder of evidence. "You have certificates signed by Inspector Michael Torres, dated March 15th of last year." Interesting thing about that Inspector Torres was in the hospital having emergency surgery on March 15th. Funny how he managed to inspect your property while he was unconscious on an operating table. Chen's wife appeared in the doorway behind him, clutching a coffee mug and looking confused. "Robert, what's happening? Why are there fire trucks in our driveway?" State Fire Investigator Janet Morrison stepped forward, her badge gleaming in the morning sun. "Mrs. Chen, I'm afraid your husband is under investigation for multiple felonies related to fire safety fraud. This property cannot be legally occupied until we complete our investigation." "Felonies?" Mrs. Chen's voice went up an octave. "Robert, what is she talking about?" But Chen wasn't listening to his wife. He was staring at me with naked hatred, finally understanding that the game had completely changed. "You orchestrated this whole thing. You're abusing your position to get revenge because I filed legitimate complaints about your property." "Actually, Robert," I said, savoring every word, "this investigation was initiated by evidence your own people provided. See, when you filed all those complaints with the State Fire Marshal's office about my conflict of interest, they decided to review all the fire safety documentation for Pine Lake Estates. Imagine their surprise when they discovered that 60% of the inspection certificates were forgeries." Morrison held up a thick folder. "Mr. Chen, we have documented evidence of mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud federal agencies, and systematic falsification of public safety documents. You're looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison." Chen's face went ashen. Behind him, his wife dropped her coffee mug, sending ceramic shards and hot liquid across their marble foyer. "Robert, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't." "Shut up, Linda," Chen snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. "Just shut up and call my lawyer." But I wasn't done. I'd waited 6 months for this moment, and I was going to savor every second of Chen's downfall. "There's more, Robert. Tell me, do you remember the Matthews family? Elderly couple, lived on Elm Street until their house burned down last year?" Chen's eyes widened. He knew exactly what I was talking about. "Funny thing about that fire," I continued conversationally. "At the time, it looked like an accident. Faulty wiring, Old house, tragic but not suspicious. But when we started digging through your HOA records, we found some interesting correspondence. Seems you'd been pressuring the Matthews to sell for months. When they refused, you filed complaints about their property being a fire hazard. Then, mysteriously, their house burned down just 2 weeks later. Rodriguez stepped up beside me. We're reopening that investigation, Mr. Chen, along with 3 other suspicious fires involving property owners who refused to sell to your development partners. Chen was backing toward his front door now, his face a mask of panic and rage. This is all lies. You can't prove any of this. You're making up charges because you can't handle losing to someone better than you. That's when State Investigator Morrison played the trump card that even I didn't know was coming. Actually, Mr. Chen, we can prove it, she said, pulling out her phone. See, we've been monitoring your communications for the past week. Federal wiretaps, authorized by a federal judge based on evidence of ongoing conspiracy. Would you like to hear the conversation you had Saturday night with your associate Marcus Webb about hiring someone to take care of the Mitchell problem permanently? She pressed play, and Chen's voice filled the morning air, crystal clear and completely damning. I don't care what it costs. Mitchell has ruined everything. First, the fire didn't work. Now he's got the feds involved. Find someone who can make this go away permanently and make it look like an accident. The blood drained from Chen's face as his own words condemned him. Behind him, his wife was sobbing, the full scope of her husband's criminality finally hitting her. But even facing complete destruction, Chen's arrogance wouldn't let him surrender quietly. You think you've won something here, Mitchell? You have no idea what you've started. I have friends, connections you can't imagine. Judges, prosecutors, people who can make your life hell in ways you never dreamed of. I stepped closer, close enough that only he could hear my next words. Robert, let me explain something to you. For 6 months, you've been playing games with a man whose grandfather taught him that sometimes you have to fight for what matters. You tried to murder my family. You terrorized my wife. You targeted my 8-year-old daughter. Did you really think I was going to play by your rules? Chen opened his mouth to respond, but Morrison was already reading him his rights. Robert Chen, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation of murder for hire. You have the right to remain silent. As the handcuffs clicked around Chen's wrists, I felt a satisfaction deeper than revenge. This wasn't just about payback, it was about justice. About protecting not just my family, but every family Chen had terrorized, every homeowner he'd defrauded, every person whose life he'd endangered with his forged safety certificates. The last thing Chen said before they put him in the police car was directed at me. This isn't over, Mitchell. Even from prison, I can destroy you. I watched the police car disappear down the street, then turned to Rodriguez. David, I want comprehensive safety inspections of every single property in Pine Lake Estates. Real inspections this time, by the book. Any violations get immediately reported to the county. That's going to shut down half the neighborhood, he warned. I thought about my daughter Emma, about the fear in Sarah's eyes, about the flames that had nearly consumed our family legacy. Good, I said. Maybe next time they'll think twice before trying to murder their neighbors. You'd think that watching their president get arrested for conspiracy to commit murder would slow down the Pine Lake Estates HOA board. You'd be wrong. If anything, Chen's arrest triggered a desperate, vicious counterattack that proved these people were willing to burn everything down rather than accept defeat. The emergency board meeting was called for Tuesday evening, less than 24 hours after Chen's arrest. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be. Sarah and I sat in our restored cabin utilities, magically working again, Now that Chen was in federal custody, listening to the shouting matches echoing across the lake from the community center. My phone rang at 9:47 p.m. Marcus Webb, my attorney, sounded exhausted but grimly satisfied. "Thomas, you need to know what just happened at that HOA meeting. I had a source inside recording everything." "Tell me." "They voted to file an emergency lawsuit against you personally and against North Shore Fire Services. They're claiming you orchestrated a conspiracy to frame Chen, that you planted evidence and coerced witness testimony. They want a federal judge to issue an injunction preventing you from conducting any fire safety activities in their neighborhood." I wasn't surprised. Desperate people do desperate things. What else? They've hired Cromwell, Preston, and Associates to represent them. That's a $2,000 an hour law firm, Thomas. These people are betting everything on destroying you before the federal case against Chen goes to trial. Cromwell, Preston, and Associates. I knew that name. They specialized in defending white-collar criminals and had a reputation for burying their opponents in paperwork and legal bills. The HOA board was essentially hiring a nuclear weapon to fight a neighborhood dispute. But their legal assault was just the beginning. Wednesday morning, I arrived at North Shore Fire Services to find protesters surrounding our headquarters. About 30 people carrying signs that read CORRUPTF, IRECHIAF, and PROTEECTURC, UOMM, UNIT, YFROMNT, CHELL. The local news was there, of course, filming everything for the evening broadcast. The protest leader was Janet Morrison, not the state investigator, but Chen's next-door neighbor and one of his staunchest allies on the HOA board. She'd positioned herself directly in front of our main entrance, forcing our fire trucks to navigate around the crowd every time we got a call. "Thomas Mitchell has abused his power to terrorize law-abiding homeowners," she shouted into a Channel 7 news camera. "He's used false charges and fabricated evidence to destroy a respected community leader who is only trying to maintain property values and safety standards." The reporter, a young woman who clearly hadn't done her homework, nodded sympathetically. "What do you want to see happen, Mrs. Morrison?" "Mitchell needs to be removed from his position immediately. His fire department contracts should be revoked. And Robert Chen should be released from jail and formally apologized to by the county prosecutor." I watched from my office window as Morrison continued her performance, painting Chen as a martyred community servant and me as a corrupt tyrant. The optics were terrible. It looked like I was hiding in my office while an angry community demanded justice. That's when I decided it was time to go on the offensive. I walked outside and approached the news crew directly. The crowd of protesters fell silent as I stepped into camera range, clearly not expecting me to engage. "I'm Thomas Mitchell," I said to the reporter. "I understand there are some concerns about our investigation into Robert Chen and the HOA fraud case." The reporter's eyes lit up. This was going to be great television. "Mr. Mitchell, how do you respond to allegations that you've abused your authority to target innocent community members?" "Well," I said calmly, "I think the evidence speaks for itself." I pulled out my phone and showed the screen to the camera. "This is a recording of Robert Chen, made Saturday night, discussing plans to have me murdered. Would you like to hear it?" I played just enough of the recording to make my point. Chen's voice, crystal clear, talking about making me go away permanently. The crowd of protesters shifted uncomfortably, some of them backing away from Morrison. "That recording was obtained through a federal wiretap authorized by a federal judge," I continued. "Along with bank records showing payments to known arsonists, forged fire safety documents, and evidence of at least 4 suspicious house fires targeting homeowners who refused to sell to Chen's developer partners." Morrison tried to interrupt. "Those charges haven't been proven in court." "You're right," I said, turning to face her directly. "They haven't been proven in court yet. but they will be. And when they are, everyone who supported Chen, everyone who helped him cover up his crimes, everyone who participated in this conspiracy, they're all going to face the same federal charges he's facing. The color drained from Morrison's face. She hadn't expected me to fight back so directly, so publicly. Behind her, I could see other protesters quietly slipping away, suddenly remembering they had somewhere else to be. But Morrison wasn't done. That afternoon, she held a press conference announcing that the HOA was filing a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, demanding a criminal investigation into my conduct. They were also petitioning the county commissioners to revoke North Shore Fire Service's emergency response contract. Thursday brought their most desperate move yet. Someone and I had a pretty good idea who had filed a complaint with Child Protective Services claiming that my erratic and criminal behavior made me an unfit parent. They wanted Emma removed from our home for her own safety. When the social worker showed up at our door Thursday evening, Sarah was ready for her. Our house was immaculate. Emma was happy and healthy, and we had character references from teachers, neighbors, and community leaders. The investigation lasted about 20 minutes before the social worker apologetically closed the case as unfounded. But the final, most pathetic attempt at retaliation came Friday morning. I got a call from Fire Chief Rebecca Santos at the State Fire Marshal's office. "Thomas, I've got some interesting news. The Pine Lake Estates, HOA, has filed a formal complaint claiming that your fire department is deliberately slow-walking emergency responses to their neighborhood. They're saying you're endangering lives as revenge for the Chen investigation." I laughed, despite myself. "Rebecca, you have access to all our response time data. What do our actual numbers show?" That's the beautiful part. Your average response time to Pine Lake Estates calls has actually improved by 14% since Chen's arrest. They're complaining about response times that are better than the county average. These people were so desperate, so committed to their narrative of victimhood, that they were literally making up problems that didn't exist. They'd convinced themselves that they were the real victims in this story, that Chen was innocent and I was the villain. But their desperation was about to backfire spectacularly. Because while they'd been wasting time and money on lawyers and protests and fake complaints, the federal investigation had been quietly building an airtight case against every single member of the HOA board. Monday morning, I got the call I'd been waiting for. U.S. Attorney Patricia Walsh wanted to meet with me to discuss the federal charges they were filing against the entire Pine Lake Estates conspiracy. The HOA board had thought they were fighting a neighborhood dispute. They were about to discover they'd been waging war against the United States government. And that was a war they could never win. 6 months later, I was sitting on my grandfather's deck with Emma, teaching her to tie fishing knots while Sarah prepared lunch in the kitchen behind us. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the autumn colors like a mirror, and for the first time in over a year, everything felt genuinely peaceful. The federal trials were over. Robert Chen had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, arson, and solicitation of murder. 4 other HOA board members received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. Janet Morrison, who'd led the protests against me, got 12 years after investigators discovered she'd been the one coordinating the fake inspection certificates. The Pine Lake Estates development itself had been essentially dismantled. When federal investigators conducted comprehensive safety inspections using real fire safety standards, they found that over 70% of the houses had serious code violations that made them unsafe for occupancy. The cost to bring everything up to code bankrupted the HOA, and most of the McMansions were eventually torn down and rebuilt from scratch. But the real satisfaction wasn't watching Chen's empire crumble, it was what came after. The Matthews family, whose house had burned down in what we now knew was Chen's first arson attack, sued the HOA's insurance company for $10 million and won. They used the money to build a beautiful new home and establish a foundation to help other families who'd been victimized by corrupt homeowner associations. 3 other families who'd lost their homes in suspicious fires over the past 2 years came forward with evidence they'd been afraid to share before. Each case led to additional federal charges, additional sentences, and additional justice for people who'd thought they had nowhere to turn. "Dad," Emma said, holding up her fishing line with a perfectly tied clinch knot, "why did those people try to hurt us?" It was a question I'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that some adults are willing to commit murder over property values and neighborhood aesthetics? "Sometimes, sweetheart," I said carefully, "people get so focused on what they want that they forget about right and wrong. They forget that other people have feelings and families and dreams that matter just as much as theirs do." "But you stopped them, right? With the fire department?" I smiled, thinking about how to frame this in terms she could understand. I had advantages that helped me fight back, yes. But the real power wasn't owning the fire department, Emma. It was being willing to do the right thing, even when it was scary and difficult. Sarah joined us on the deck, carrying a tray of sandwiches and iced tea. She'd been the strongest through all of this, holding our family together while I fought the legal and professional battles. Now she was finally able to relax, to enjoy our cabin without looking over her shoulder for signs of sabotage or harassment. "Any regrets?" she asked, settling into her chair with a contented sigh. But looking at Emma's proud smile as she showed her mother the fishing knot she'd just learned, watching Sarah finally relax for the first time in months, sitting on the deck my grandfather had built with his own hands 70 years ago, I knew the answer. "No regrets," I said. "Some fights are worth having, even when they're scary. Especially when they're scary." The truth was, Chen and his cronies had taught me something valuable about power and responsibility. I'd bought into North Shore Fire Services as a business investment, but I'd learned that owning a fire department, owning any kind of authority, comes with an obligation to protect people, not exploit them. Over the past 6 months, we'd reformed our inspection processes, implemented new transparency measures, and established an independent review board to handle any complaints about conflicts of interest. We'd turned what had been a routine government contractor into a model of public safety accountability. More importantly, we'd sent a message to every corrupt HOA, every crooked developer, every bully who thought they could terrorize families with impunity. We'd proven that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys can win if they're willing to fight smart and fight clean. "Dad," Emma asked, "can we live here forever?" I looked out over the lake, at the trees my grandfather had watched grow from saplings, at the water where 4 generations of my family had learned to swim and fish and find peace in a chaotic world. "Forever," I promised her. "This is our home, and nobody's ever going to take it away from us again." As the sun set over the lake, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine contentment. We'd fought for what mattered most: family, home, justice, and we'd won. The lesson here isn't about revenge or getting even with people who wrong you. It's about standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. It's about using whatever power you have, whether that's owning a fire department or just being willing to document evidence and call the authorities to protect the people and places you love. Chen thought he could terrorize us into submission because he had money and connections and local political influence. But he forgot that real power comes from doing the right thing for the right reasons, even when it's difficult and dangerous. If you've made it this far in my story, I want you to remember something. Bullies like Chen count on good people staying quiet, backing down, accepting defeat rather than fighting back. They win when we're too scared or too tired to stand up for ourselves. But sometimes, just sometimes, they pick the wrong fight with the wrong family. And when that happens, justice has a way of catching up with them. If this story helped you, if it reminded you that regular people can still win against corruption and intimidation, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Because the world needs more stories about good people fighting back and winning. And remember, when someone tries to burn down your life, sometimes the best revenge is building it back stronger than before.